Okay, we are live. I'm Mike Arouse. This is a video chat with Alexis Gonzales-Black, talking about responsive organizations and teams. Just a little background about myself. I'm an independent consultant, spent the last 7+ years at a company called Undercurrent, where we kind of specialize in helping organizations to change the way they work and the way that they organize to succeed in the 21st century. I'm out on my own now, and I am focusing my efforts on working with teams on how they work together to become better, faster, more innovative, and everything else. Alexis, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I realize watching two people on a Google Hangout may not be the most exciting format, so I'll try to be engaging as possible. But I am Alexis Gonzales-Black. I spent the last few years working at Zappos.com, leading the Holacracy implementation there. And Holacracy is just one brand that we used at Zappos. Since leaving Zappos probably about 3.5 months ago now, I started my own consultancy, and I work out of the Bay Area helping companies of all sizes implement self-organizing principles. So I'm just kind of poking around doing my own work now.
Great. So the lens that I'm bringing to this kind of focused on teams specifically, and the reason why I'm particularly interested in teams as opposed to organizations or individuals, kind of on either side of teams. My belief is that we're moving into an era as computers, artificial intelligence, robotics begins to eat away at more and more routine work, that the most interesting and important work for human beings to do is the least routine, kind of place where there's the most amount of uncertainty and the most amount of creativity and collaboration is required. And I believe that this is where small groups of people working closely together really make the biggest difference. So that's why I'm kind of focusing on teams, and I'm curious to hear, Alexis, why do you think teams are important in this day and age?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this the other day because as the workforce becomes more and more sort of freelance, if you will. So I heard this that, in 10 or so years that 50% of the workforce will be freelance. I have no citation for that, so I could be making that up, but I heard that recently. But I think that there is truth to that the workforce is becoming more fluid. And this made me think about teams because for me, teams are kind of a source of identity, if you will, like you get some kind of shared purpose, some kind of shared mission, and your team is your sort of home base. It is where you develop sort of loyalty and identity and in the work that you're doing. And so I was thinking about the kind of destabilizing nature of how the workforce is becoming more and more freelance and what that will mean for sort of tight-knit teams. We saw that happen at Zappos a little bit when we first moved to self-organizing because people become free to move from team to team. And all of a sudden, it is not the same static structure that you've been in for a while. So I think these experiences have kind of led me to believe that having a sense of team is really having a sense of identity, a sense of shared purpose, a sense of shared accountability of people who will, hold you accountable when you've kind of gone off track. So
Yeah, it's interesting, just the idea of that idea of having a sense of team. At Undercurrent, we've gone through, Undercurrent went through a lot of organizational changes and transformations over the time that I was there. But about a year and a half ago, right, when we first adopted Holacracy, there was actually a kind of breakdown of teams, because we were kind of caught in this weird middle where at the time there were about 25 people total at Undercurrent. So we had a strong sense of overall organizational team, but most of the project work and our client work was owned by, individuals or groups of 2, 3, maybe as many as 6 people at a time. And those groups changed very frequently, and there was a lot of movement from week to week and month to month on who was on that. And as a result, there was a lack of a sense of team at that level, which became problematic, I think, over time. And one of the big changes we moved to about, maybe 6 months ago, Undercurrent shifted to a model where we had more stable and consistent teams for our larger clients, so that 6 or 7 people remained together, and that made a big difference in what it felt like and how those teams operated.
I stupidly forgot to plug in my computer. I'm gonna disappear for 1 second. I'll be right back.
No problem at all. We're gonna have to create a checklist for this stuff.
I know. Well, I have it plugged into my computer, but I realized it wasn't plugged into the wall. The other important part of the power connection. It's like, oh, how convenient. All right, I'm back.
All right, so next question. Think of a time when you were part of a really awesome, high-functioning team, and tell me about it.
So I think that the last time is a pretty recent example, and it was when the implementation team was formed at Zappos. And I think what was cool about it was that it was a brand new sort of charge for the company. There was excitement around this sort of concept in this project we were doing. And it was an opportunity for people who had sort of shared passion to come together and work on something new. And in that sense, it felt very much like the early days of a startup, what I would imagine that to feel like, right? You have a small group of people who are passionate about something. There aren't really clearly defined roles at that point, but folks are so passionate about it. They're sort of, self-motivated, and it's an all hands on deck sort of feeling. And constantly I would show up to work and team members would tell me about new things they were working on and new projects. And it was just this sense of like, you never knew, what new piece of work would be created. And the fact that you were surrounded by people who were, that motivated I think it was, a great experience.
Right. How many people were in that group?
So in the beginning, there were only 3 of us, but grew to 5 or 6 of us by the time I left. And I think that whole time, for about a year and a half, when we had, 5 folks, that whole time I would say we were a high functioning team.
Yeah. And do you remember what your purpose was?
Yeah, what was so funny about purpose is that in the beginning before we had uploaded all of our, really gotten specific about purpose and sat down and done a purpose creation activity, there was almost a shared implicit understanding of purpose, which I realize is kind of a bad word in holacracy. Implicit anything, everything's supposed to be explicit. But there was sort of a shared implicit purpose of bringing change to the company and sort of helping the company think outside of the box and challenging the traditional management structure. And I think that it was kind of an interesting shift for us having this sort of implicit shared purpose. And then we sat down, a couple weeks or a couple months into our circle coming together and got really explicit about purpose. And I don't know if that mattered so much because we all just had this really deeply ingrained sense of implicit purpose of bringing change, kind of embracing and driving change for the company.
Yeah. You mentioned a kind of purpose creation exercise or something like that. I'm curious, especially I should say for anyone watching who isn't as familiar with holacracy, one of the things in holacracy, in the system, is that every team that is created, or every circle in holacracy speak that's created, has an explicit defined purpose that the group or the team owns. So in Zappos at that scale, you have a lot of teams and consequently a lot of purposes that need to be defined and articulated. Yeah, did you have some kind of process for creating those?
Yeah, I mean, the process was not very sophisticated. It was just sitting down as a team. And I think the lead link or kind of the leader of that team came up with a purpose. And then the rest of us had the chance to sort of update it or change it as we saw fit.
Mhm.
But I think this has been kind of I've had an interesting kind of journey with purpose in holacracy, because when you create purpose in holacracy, you're supposed to create the purpose of the work, absent of your own personal purpose, right? And I think a lot of times when we think of purpose, we think of our own mission and like why we show up to work. But
Mhm.
in holacracy, the charge that you're given is to find the purpose of the work, absent of your own sort of projected desires or interests. Like,
Mhm.
what is the purpose of that circle? And so I think that it's a helpful exercise, kind of asking that question, saying like, all right, like what good can this circle do in the company or in the world, right? Asking that question.
Mhm.
Um, but I also think that it leaves out a pretty important component, which is finding your own personal purpose and connecting that to the work that you're doing. And so what we found was, as people created purposes, you have to imagine we have over 400 circles at Zappos. So 400 implicit purposes overnight became explicit purposes, right? And that activity of creating purpose, I think one like pretty critical piece that we were missing out on was helping people find their personal purpose and how that connected to the work. So I think they're doing some of that work now, but yeah, that exercise was really
Yeah.
interesting.
I, I've been watching season one of the HBO show In Treatment, which was on
Yeah.
years ago about like psychiatrist meeting with people. In any case, random episode, this character on it said that there's an important difference between purpose and mission. And the difference is that purpose has this implied personal connection to it,
Yeah.
whereas a mission is something that someone else can give to you that doesn't necessarily have any personal connection.
Yeah. That's
Um,
smart. Maybe we should call it mission then
well,
in holacracy.
yeah, and so what I've this is just my own personal belief, but observing these practices in holacracy and how purpose is used in holacracy over the past few years, and also thinking about how Undercurrent applied some of the same principles inside of non-holacratic organizations. Uh, my belief is that there should be that the purpose should be you should only use the term purpose to talk about the entire collective organizational wide goal. You know, what are we all here for, and why are we all here together?
Mm-hmm.
That's the purpose. And at every layer below that kind of collective, that collective layer, we should be talking about missions, and the mission should be kind of time bound. And as you go down through the organization or out to the edges of the organization, the mission should basically get shorter and shorter in terms of their time. So at the equivalent of like a C-suite, the missions that a chief executive, a chief officer might hold, it might be assumed that they last at least 12 months. And I would say no mission should ever last longer than 12 months, because you should
Yes.
always have some mechanism for checking in and saying, is this still a worthwhile mission?
Yeah.
And then, at the divisional or at the managerial level or the, brand level or whatever it is in the kind of business you're in, you might have quarterly missions, and you might have month-long or week-long
Yeah.
missions.
Yeah. I think that's a fair point, because I think what happened, having to produce a mission or a purpose at every single level of the organization, it almost like over processed purpose,
Yes.
right? We were
Yeah.
almost like sitting down and spending so much brain space trying to come up with all these purposes. They became sort of blank placeholder statements. And I think that was even true for our broadest circle. So our C-suite circle, which we called the internal board. So when we first moved into holacracy, I think there was an implicit purpose before holacracy, right? And if you were to ask any Zapponian kind of what is the purpose of Zappos, they would tell you to live and deliver wow. simple, right? And so concrete. Like when you got on the phones and you were interacting with customers, you could actually like make them say wow. Like it was so tangible, right? Like if you could get the customer to say wow, you get extra points, right? That was like kind of how I saw the purpose of Zappos when I first got there. So simple, so straightforward, and so kind of tangible. And then when we moved into Holacracy, we came up with this like really long purpose statement, and it was like delivering happiness to our shareholders and our customers and our internal employees in a sustainable and long-term way. And all of a sudden we had this kind of very over processed, very non-organic purpose, and I think it really kind of divorced people from the kind of central sort of battle cry of Zappos. And I learned recently that they have changed the purpose back to live and deliver wow.
Yeah.
So it kind of went through that whole life cycle, of trying to like, an over processed kind of, overly wrought purpose to now, again, back to the more simple sort of battle cry, which I think is a good move.
Yeah, we struggled, and obviously at a much, much smaller scale, and yet we struggled with a similar problem at Undercurrent, where when you're given the opportunity to think about purpose for at any level, just the word itself carries with all these big kind of, it's an invitation to overthink things or to try to do
pull out a thesaurus and like come up with the best word you could possibly, when something else was more functional. And that's really what self-organization is about, right? It's about like cutting to the work and enabling the work to happen. And so I think, spending too much time sort of crafting these elaborate purpose statements ended up not being in the best interest of the work, right? To use the most simple, most straightforward, most kind of tangible purpose. So anyway, that was one of the lessons that we learned.
So in speaking about, it's about, it's about the work or allowing groups of people to do good work. What do you think, what are some of the things that are preventing people from doing good work together in most organizations these days?
I think, I find myself back in the same position over and over again, which is talking about like human insecurity, which is strange because I like to fancy myself like a very, technical person, and I've got all of these like tools and fixes for, management structures. But really, the end of the conversation about team dysfunction always has me coming back to the same thing over and over again, which is like bad communication skills, the inability to have difficult conversations, people with crippling insecurity who are unable to like ask the right questions or, surface the right data. So, I think what it comes down to is, for people at least, developing a skill set that allows them to have difficult conversations. I think for the most part, when teams are dysfunctional, what I observe when I watch dysfunctional teams is I see that there's like a conversation going on, but there's like a real conversation that's like begging to be had, right? Like right below the surface. And I don't know if you call that like the A conversation and the B conversation, but you can tell people are kind of like dancing around something, and there's just like this B conversation needs to be the A conversation. And a lot of times that's a conversation about, clear expectations. It's a conversation about when somebody is stepping on somebody else's toes, about tension. It's about surfacing like what is the real conversation. So that I think is,
And even things as simple as what needs to get done and who's going to do it.
Yeah.
Which I think a lot of people would say, well, of course, it's obvious that you need to know what needs to get done and who's going to do it. But it's shocking how the kind of the norms and the normal ways of communicating, behaving in most, especially corporate environments, actually obscure what has to get done and who's going to do it.
Yeah. Sometimes it's asking the most simple question, right? Like, what role do you want to do this work?
Yeah.
Like, there's this great idea for a project and you just ask like, who, what role? And people just freeze like, oh, we have to like pin this to somebody. There's just this like, there's this conversation that needs to be had. Yeah.
Yeah. I was doing an exercise recently with a client. We were just trying to articulate some some short-term experiments or initiatives that that the group is going to undertake. And it was amazing how, especially around who was going to be involved and what were they, I asked people to say, all right, who's going to be responsible for this, and describe the roles that each of those individuals are going to perform. And they just immediately, even with that prompt, defaulted to just listing all the people who might be related to the thing, without really, and so you end up with this long list of people who are attached to it, none of whom are necessarily responsible for anything.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we see that happen all the time, right? Like there's a neat project that comes up and there are 4 people in the room that are like, oh, I can help with that. Like, like send me an email. And I'm like, well, who's sending the email? Like who's rallying this team, right? You have a bunch of interests, but no single line of ownership or line of accountability. And I think, that level of clarity and pushing teams to get there, that's what high functioning teams do. They have a level of clarity.
And so from the point of view of leadership, and this could be at any level, but anyone who's in a position where they need to create the conditions for some other team or some other group to do great work, what's your advice to, what does the system or what does management need to do in order to create conditions for teams to do great work together?
Yeah. When I read this question, when you sent it to me, I kind of laughed because I almost think that the answer to this question, for me at least, is what do management teams need to not do? Like, what do they need to stop doing? Is really like the answer that came to mind. And the things that I think people need to stop doing is stop solving all of the problems for your team. Stop expecting the team members to come to you with every gripe. Stop expecting just like full, like not transparency, but just like being looped in on everything. And I think that like freeing of the folks to do their work. And when you show up, in an advisory context, show up with advice, with data, but instead of trying to control the process, really like distancing yourself from the process, allowing people to handle their own business and to do their own work. I saw this recently I'm taking an example from my fiance, and he showed up at home and he was like, I don't know who to talk to about this. Like something happened. Should I ping my manager or my manager's manager? Like somebody, has got to take care of this for me. And I was like, well, why don't you just try to take care of it yourself, right? Like, why don't you just reach directly out to that person? And I think the response is that my manager would get mad, right? Like if I tried to solve a problem without them in the know or without them looped in or CC'd or BCC'd or whatever. And I think the exact opposite needs to happen, right? Like managers need to say, if you can take care of it on your own, take care of it on your own, right? I don't need to be BCC'd on everything. And I'm not here to solve your problems for you. So I think encouraging people to self-manage.
Mm-hmm. I think especially when I'm reading this book, The Idea Factory, about Bell Labs, the kind of history of Bell Labs. It's really fascinating. But one of the things that is interesting that they talk about, these are all these like the world's most brilliant scientists coming together to invent incredible things in the 20th century. And talking about the way that they thought about management and what's the role of someone's boss in an incredibly creative and kind of inventive environment like that. They really talk about it in terms of, it's definitely not about solving problems for people. Much more importantly, it's about asking the right questions or framing things in the right way.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot about I think this is something I read in Reinventing Organizations. Maybe not, I could be making that up, but this idea called the advice model, where when you're making a decision, you seek advice and you seek data, but ultimately you're the one who makes that decision, right? You're not seeking consensus. You're not seeking for sign off by anybody else. because there is value, right? Like a lot of time managers and senior level folks are in that position because they of experience that they've had and because of knowledge that they have. And so I'm not saying throw that out the door. I think, you know, acknowledging that there is value in experience and in knowledge and integrating that to whatever extent you feel is right, you know, for you as the owner of that work, right? So I think it's just kind of shifting that mindset of one of like needing approval to seeking advice.
Yeah. So one more question, and we should wrap up in a few minutes. But going back to the kind of human side of all of this, how do you balance the ideals of kind of having a flat organization or having that a lack of hierarchy inside of a team with just the realities of like human relationships and that kind of implicit power structures always emerge and there's no way around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that moving to holacracy or self-organization was not about getting rid of hierarchy. And I think we actually did a bad job of communicating this in the beginning because we were all so enchanted with this idea of flat organization that we were like, oh, everybody has the same power and everybody, titles go away and managers go away and all this stuff. But I think what we fail to kind of acknowledge, which is really important, is that there is natural hierarchy, right? There's emerging hierarchy just in by nature of the kind of work people take on. Some people have a larger scope of responsibility or a larger scope of impact than other roles, right? And I think what's great about moving to self-organization is not that it gets rid of, hierarchy altogether, but it allows hierarchy to emerge naturally. Like as people want to take on larger projects, they have the freedom and ability to do that. And that, in a sense, is a hierarchy of work, right? And they then become a person that has a larger scope of influence over the company, right? And so I think it's not about getting rid of hierarchy, but just acknowledging like sort of natural hierarchy and making sure that your governance structure, whatever sort of like repository you have for keeping the governance structure, that it evolves as well as those natural hierarchies begin to emerge that we recognize when people are taking on larger scopes of work. So
how do you account for the fact that like if like what you're describing sounds like, in the most ideal version is this very kind of meritocratic kind of it all in the service of the work and in service of the purpose, and whatever hierarchy naturally emerges is the kind of the best one for the work and for the purpose.
Yeah.
But again, in reality, things like gender come into play, or all kinds of other biases kind of come into play that creep in and influence that emergent hierarchy in a negative way.
Yeah. That's so true, right? It's not a meritocracy. There's no such thing as a pure meritocracy in the society that we live in. And I think for me, it's just about, we talked earlier about making that B conversation, the A conversation. And so I think in the same sort of habit of doing that in the work, making sure that you are creating safe spaces and conditions for that B conversation of gender disparity and, equity of pay and, equity of opportunity, making sure everybody has equal opportunity to get roles. You have to make sure that that B conversation is a very A conversation in your company. And if that means creating circles around diversity or creating roles of mentors who are constantly on the lookout and watching out for these things, I think just making sure that you are having that discussion, no matter how uncomfortable that discussion may be for people. And I think the good thing about moving to self-organization is it at least gives space for that conversation to happen. I think in the traditional sort of hierarchy, that those conversations of diversity are often kind of pushed to the side, or maybe they're like supplemental. We've got the real work, and then we've got like the fun, the sort of like diversity conversations happening over here. But I think with holacracy, at least, you can create circles that are integral to the core of the company, and they can show up in tech, they can show up in any one of our functional areas, and they're not limited kind of by where they should belong in the org structure. So fair question. Yeah.
Do you think that heavily structured systems like holacracy, which has, you know, a lot of rules and rigor to it, do you think that that rigor and that structure helps create kind of like a better environment to, you know, a safer environment for those dynamics?
I think there are probably two sides of that, right? My initial, at first blush, I think the answer is yes, right? Because a system where every single person gets sacred space that nobody else can encroach upon to share their reactions, to share their proposals. And that space is protected by a facilitator. So if anybody tries to jump in and kind of dogpile on your idea or take your idea, as so many, I think people have, you know, that experience has happened to them where they say something and then a man says it and all of a sudden, you know, the man gets the credit for the idea. And so I think the idea of creating sort of sacred space and boundaries around that give you the freedom. I think that's a big step towards, you know, creating equity in the workplace. But I think at the same side, on the other side of the coin, is that it encourages really transparent conversations about tensions. And I think a lot of folks can have interpreted that as being sort of a masculine way of dealing with and surfacing tension and kind of putting it out on the table and fighting it out. And I know you've read Team of Teams, right?
No, not yet. Not yet.
Oh, you haven't read Team of Teams?
Yeah,
okay. So
Adam has been recommending it to me. Adam.
yes, yeah. So Stanley McChrystal, General McChrystal, you know, it talks about Team of Teams, and it's all war stories, right? And I think, you know, there is this sort of masculine tint to these conversations that encourage like radical transparency and in the moment sort of like surfacing of tension. So I think, you know, it's all about the way that you implement it and like how you treat the system, because I think it can be kind of both good and bad.
Yeah. Great. Well, this has been terrific. Is there anything that I can answer for you, or anything else that you wanted to share before we wrap up?
No, I think that this has been long enough. Hopefully there's something interesting, some nuggets of, you know, interesting conversation that happened here. And yeah, thanks to you for hosting this, and to anybody else that's listening for caring long enough to get to the end of this conversation.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop this now, and then I'll follow up with you afterwards.
Okay, sounds good. Bye.
Bye.